right. So good morning. We're very happy to once again host an event with our friends from Pew Research Center. Our collaboration with Pew is one of our most important ones, and we're very grateful that the experts at Pew regularly grant our members exclusive insights into their research. I am Katharina Draheim. I'm head of communications here at Atlantik-Brücke, and I will be moderating this event. Today, we will hear about a world in tumult, changing views in and of the United States. The data is about public opinion of China, the United States, and the Biden administration, and will be presented by Jacob Poushter. Jacob is an associate director at Pew Research Center. He is an expert in international survey research and writes about international public opinion. He is also well-versed in designing surveys and analyzing data. Jacob holds a master's degree in international affairs from American University and a bachelor's degree in history from Williams College. He is the author of studies on global attitudes of cultural change and views of the German-American relationship, among others. The data Jacob is presenting is from 3 different surveys, all conducted this year, and you will hear more about that from Jacob in a minute. After the presentation, there will be time for your questions, and I encourage you to post those in the Q&A as soon as you think of them, and we will be, hopefully we will have enough time to answer all of them. So Jacob, thank you for taking the time to be here with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Katharina. It's a pleasure to be here. Lovely to be in Germany talking to people about world public opinion. And so what I'll do is just go through my slides. If people have questions, please let me know. Interested in if people have insights into what they see in the data, or if they have questions about methodology, please ask any question that comes to mind, and I will try to answer it to the best of my ability. So first off, who are the Pew Research Center? Well, we're a nonprofit fact tank that informs the world about issues, attitudes, and trends. We're nonpartisan, non-advocacy, and we do not take policy positions or make policy recommendations. We're a subsidiary of the Pew Charitable Trust, which is our primary funder. And our goal is to generate a foundation of facts to enrich public dialogue. And that's why we talk to groups in Germany, around the world, those who know policy, those who are informed, and those who are interested in what the world holds, because we know, having that knowledge about the world, having that understanding of public opinion helps policymakers in particular make good policy decisions. We primarily conduct public opinion research, but we also do demographic research and social science research as well. Next slide, please. So as Katharina said, that this data comes from a couple different surveys. The American data is actually from 3 separate surveys, 1 conducted in February and then 2 conducted in late summer, early fall. That data is collected from the Pew Research Center's own in-house American Trends panel, which is an online survey panel that's nationally representative. And so that's administered online. The data from the 16 other publics around the world, which is concentrated mostly in Europe and East Asia, was conducted from March to May. They're telephone interviews, and they're also nationally representative of the entire populations of these countries. Just 2 brief notes about the data and some sort of caveats. The international data was conducted in March to May. So this is before a whole host of international events. So just keep that in mind when looking at that data. And I'll also say that because of the pandemic, we weren't able to do surveys in many of the countries that we normally do in Central and Eastern Europe, Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. And that's because we employ face-to-face methodology in those countries. And during the pandemic, it was just not feasible to knock on people's doors and talk to them for 45 minutes. But we do hope to be back in the field in many of those countries starting next year. Next slide, please. So first, I'm going to talk about US Image Abroad from our spring 2021 survey. Next slide. So the big findings from this past year's survey is that confidence in the US president has really had a massive change over the last year with the transition from President Trump to President Biden. At the end of the Trump presidency, across the 12 countries in which we surveyed in both 2020 and 2021, there's been an increase, massive increase in confidence in the US president, from 17% a median in 2020 to 75% in spring of 2021. Now that jump has also led to a corresponding increase in favorability towards the US. Across those same 12 countries, a median of 34% held a favorable view of the United States at the end of the Trump presidency, and that number has jumped all the way to 62% at the beginning of the Biden presidency. Again, keep in mind that this was conducted in the spring, but also notice that confidence in the US president, does not change as much as favorability of the United States. So while favorability is up, it's not up as substantially as confidence in the US president. Next slide, please. So this is what that looks like in terms of favorability towards the US in France, Germany, Japan, Italy. And as you can see, in the last year, there's been fairly substantial jumps in US favorability in France, 31% to 65%, again, with the caveat that this was done in the spring of this year and opinions might have changed by then. Germany, we also saw a massive increase in favorability towards the United States from 26 to 59. Japan, a 30 percentage point increase, and Italy, 29 percentage point increase. And for the most part, those numbers from last year were among the lowest numbers in terms of US favorability that we had ever measured since we started doing surveys in 2000 and 2001. There was another low point after the Iraq war in France and Germany, but for the most part, the numbers from the previous year in 2020 were among the lowest ratings we've ever seen for the United States in these particular countries and most of the other countries in which we surveyed. Next slide. So as I said earlier, the jump in favorability was large, but it wasn't as large as the jump in confidence in the US president. So in 2020, when we asked Swedes what they thought of President Trump, only 15% had confidence in his ability to handle international affairs. And that jumped all the way up to 85% in the current survey, a 70 percentage point rise. We saw similar rises across Europe and East Asia, pretty much across the board, all the way down to Greece, where the 42% increase is still quite large relative to what we've seen in the past. So, Biden started his administration with very high ratings in these countries, and it will be interesting to see what happens in the subsequent years. Next slide. So when you look at this historically in Germany, France, Spain, and the UK, you see a pretty clear pattern here. Views towards Bush were never particularly high, but fell precipitously after the Iraq war in these four countries. With the election of Obama, we saw huge jumps in confidence in the US president, especially in Germany. Although there was some decline during the Obama era, especially after the 2014 NSA spying scandal, where there were some drops in Obama's confidence ratings, but they sort of jumped back up right before the end of his presidency. And then a pretty sharp decline in views of Trump, especially in France, Germany, and Spain, a little higher in the UK, but still relatively low to where they were for Obama. And then now there's a sort of consensus about President Biden, at least as of the spring, where over 70% in all these countries have confidence in his ability to handle international affairs. And as you can see, the dots end at 2021, and we'll definitely be asking this question through the Biden presidency and beyond, and see how things change in the future, because the trends are really some of the most important data that we collect, because we can see change over time and then interpret what that means for US image and US power perceptions abroad. Next slide. So despite all the positivity towards the US president and more favorable views of the US, there's still a sense among these countries that the US does not take into account the interests of countries like theirs when making foreign policy decisions. 85% in Sweden, 85% in New Zealand say that the US does not take into account the interests of their countries when making foreign policy decisions. It's 67% in France, interestingly, similarly low in Australia. 69% say that the US does not take into account the interests of their country. And then the overall median is 67%. The countries where more do say that the US takes into account their interests are Greece and Germany, 53%, 51%, and to a lesser extent Japan. But and these numbers too, on the great deal fair amount, have actually risen since last year. Under Trump, it was even lower, with the percentages who said that the US takes into account the interests of their countries. And the numbers now are actually fairly similar to what we had in the Obama era. So even back then, even with Obama being very popular and favorability of the US being higher, most said that the US did not take into account the interests of their country when making foreign policy decisions. Next slide. And one reason why American power projection maybe hasn't been as strong or as pervasive in recent years is there's a sense that American democracy is not a good model for people in these countries. We asked this question after the in wake of the January 6th riots in the US, the Capitol riot, and we found that majorities in many of these countries say that the US used to be a good example of democracy, but has not been in recent years. It's 69% who say that in Canada, 54% in Germany. So there's really a sense here that the US was a symbol for democracy around the world, but has sort of diminished in that capacity recently. On the other side, there are still people who say that the US is a good example for other countries to follow in terms of democracy, as high as 32% in Italy. But in places like Germany and Greece and France, 27% say that the US has never been a good example for other countries to follow in terms of their democracy. So a quarter in those populations, don't trust US democracy. And that, has long-term implications for US foreign policy and US power projection around the world. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take you also through international views of China to try to compare attitudes towards the US and China as sort of the rivalry between those countries continues through 2021. I wouldn't say begins, since it's been going on for a while now. So next slide. So generally, views of China are pretty negative. Majorities in almost every public that we survey have a negative view of China. And in many countries, it's quite substantial. So 88% in Japan, 80% in Sweden, 71% in Germany, 76% in the United States itself, all have negative views of China. And not many countries that we survey do have positive views of China. The only country in Europe which has a positive view of China, again, with the caveat that we weren't able to survey in Central Eastern Europe and Russia, 52% in Greece have a positive view of China, and 64% in Singapore also have a positive view of China. But there's a very large, ethnic Chinese population in Singapore, and obviously it's a little more closely aligned to China than these other countries. But really what you see here is very negative interpretations of China. And when we ask, what don't you like about China, it's often, human rights is the top issue that people name. Huge majorities in these countries say that China does not respect the personal freedoms of its people. And so there's a sense that the Chinese government does not really respect human rights. And that does, really affects attitudes towards China overall. Next slide. And attitudes towards China have actually gotten worse, especially over the last couple of years. For example, I'll take Germany here. 2004, 2005, 37% of Germans had an unfavorable and negative view of China. And that's basically doubled as of 2021, up to 71%. We've seen, similar rises in Sweden, France, the UK. Unfavorability towards China is not something that's sort of been true, in the 21st century. It's got, views towards China have gotten a lot worse. It's also the case that it doesn't necessarily tie in with who is the leader of China. Many of the data points started changing drastically in 2016, 17, many years into Xi Jinping's tenure. So it's not like US image where there can be massive changes based on changes in US leadership. This seems to be, a more recent decline, and mostly because of human rights issues. Next slide, please. And we also find pretty unpopular views of the Chinese president. Only 20% in these countries have confidence in President Xi to handle world affairs, similar to what we find for Vladimir Putin. And as you can see here too, the most popular leader we ask about is Angela Merkel, who's right next door, I've been told. And 77% have confidence in her ability to handle international affairs as she ends her tenure as the German chancellor, similar to that of Biden, and then Macron has fairly positive ratings too. When we asked about this, when we asked about these leaders last year, when Trump was still president of the United States, his numbers were down near Putin and Xi. So again, it does show you how much attitudes towards the US can shift and how much that's related to who the US president is. I will also just say one more thing about US and China. We asked other questions about whether you trust China or the US to handle climate change, whether you think that US and China have handled COVID well, whether you would prefer economic ties with China or the US. And on most of those measures, the US actually does a little better. It's more favorable views of the US than China, more likely to want economic ties with China, and more likely to say that they can deal with climate change, although that number is also low. But China does get higher ratings on its handling of COVID-19, and many countries in Europe, last time we asked the question, do think that China is the world's leading economic power. So that's kind of how the current state of public opinion looks when it comes to the United States and China. So next slide, please. So now I'm going to look at American attitudes. So this is fresher data. This comes from August and September, and it will really give you a sense of how Americans feel about the Biden administration, the Afghanistan policy, and foreign affairs in general. Next slide. So you see that in the current survey, which was as of a couple weeks ago, 44% in the United States approve of the job Biden is doing as president. This is historically, given the first year of his term, fairly low. At this time, George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, Bill Obama, and Reagan had higher ratings than Biden does right now. It's similar to where Clinton was at this point in his tenure, but Biden's numbers are still higher than that of Trump. Trump's ratings actually, you see the 44-38, they really didn't move from 38 to 44 almost the entirety of his presidency. He actually had very stable public opinion ratings in the United States. Biden, we'll have to wait and see what happens, but so far there's been a 10 percentage point decline since the beginning of his term. Most presidents do start with a honeymoon period and then a sort of decline over the first year. And then of course, next year is the midterm elections in the United States, and typically is a kind of time where there is it's seen as a referendum on the first 2 years of the incumbent president. And in most cases, the opposition party does do very well in those first midterms, but of course, we'll have to wait and see what happens next year. Next slide. So this is what Biden's approval ratings look like from a demographic perspective in the United States. You'll see that, see some things that sort of stick out to me. White Americans tend to have much more negative approval ratings of Biden compared with Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, and English-speaking Asian Americans. You also see here that on the age differences, there's not much difference between the age brackets, but generally 57% of those aged 18 to 29 disapprove of the way Biden is handling his job as president. Now that's particularly low, especially for a group that generally supports Democratic leaders more so than Republican leaders. So the fact that Biden is so low with those young people is a telling sign at this point. On the other hand, highly educated Americans are more favorable towards Biden than less educated Americans. And then of course, the partisan differences are always apparent in American public opinion, with 90% of Republicans disapproving of Biden's job as president, with 75% of Democrats approving. And that 75% is actually a bit lower than what we saw for most of the Obama era. And when Trump was president, the disapproval for him would have been 90%. So while 75% seems like a lot of support, it's actually lower than Biden would probably need to be to kind of, keep his majorities in Congress at this point. But of course, things can change as things in the United States change. But obviously, there's a lot of lot of things to do in the first year of a president. So, it might be a little too early to judge the ultimate outcome of these numbers. Next slide. And in terms of policy, Biden's ratings have basically declined on almost every aspect of policy. Fewer now than in March say that they're confident in how he's handled the coronavirus outbreak, and how he makes good decisions about foreign policy, economic policy, immigration, and especially on bringing the country closer together. We've actually seen some of his biggest declines in confidence. Even among Democrats, where only now 55% of Democrats say that Biden can bring the country closer together. But overall, these slippages have been across party lines. They've been pretty consistent, and they're basically on almost every aspect of policy that we ask about. So again, for the most part, there's not a lot of confidence in Biden as of mid-September, but we'll have to ask these questions again as we go through the next couple years and see how things change. Next slide. And a lot of the decline does come from attitudes about foreign policy. This is despite the fact that 54% of Americans say that the decision to withdraw troops from Afghanistan was the right decision versus 42% who say it was the wrong decision. And the reason why is that both Democrats and Republicans and the overall American population really feel that the US failed in its achieving its goals in Afghanistan. 69% say that, and similar levels across parties say that. So there is a sense that the Afghanistan campaign was a failure. And obviously you see the ratings for the Biden administration's handling of Afghanistan. 42% say they did a poor job, 29% say they did an only fair job. So really negative ratings towards the Afghanistan policy, a sense that it was a failure, even when on balance, Americans support the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Next slide. Now, the support for the withdrawal is interesting because similar percentages of Americans support the initial decision to use military force in Afghanistan in 2001 as, say, the decision to withdraw troops from Afghanistan in 2021 was the right decision. But you see the differences in partisan thoughts towards this, which really sort of drive the underlying dynamics, political dynamics in the United States. So 69% of Republicans say that the initial decision to use military force, of course, by George Bush, was the right decision versus only 44% of Democrats who say that. On the other hand, only 34% of Republicans say that it was the right decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, while 70% of Democrats say that. So again, as always with American public opinion, you can't just look at the overall number. You really, to sort of understand the political dynamics, do have to dig down into the partisan differences. And that often tells the story a little better than the overall top line numbers. But at the same time, Americans are of two minds. They support the initial decision and they support the decision to withdraw. Next slide. One reason Republicans are so negative on the decision to withdraw now is that they see the Taliban control of Afghanistan as a security threat to the United States. 61% of Republicans say that it's a major threat that the Taliban control Afghanistan versus only 33% of Democrats who say the same, giving us a 46% among Americans who say that it's a major threat to the security of the United States that the Taliban control Afghanistan. And of course, attitudes might change in the future. So it will be interesting to see how both people in both parties sort of react to the Afghanistan policy, whether the Afghanistan decision will have any impact on US local elections, midterm elections. Generally, foreign policy is not among the top priorities of Americans. They tend to focus more on domestic policy with some rare exceptions. But it'll be interesting to see if foreign policy plays any role in the upcoming elections, especially the Afghanistan policy, and potentially a lesser extent to the immigration policy and border control, which brings me to my last slide. Generally Americans do favor taking in thousands of refugees from Afghanistan. But again, when you look at the partisanship, Republicans are opposed to this and Democrats are much more in favor, especially liberal Democrats. And the reason Republicans are generally opposed to this policy, despite being, as well as being sort of just generally against refugees and immigration in general, is that they don't think that the the refugees can be properly screened for security. They're worried about, terrorism threat that could potentially come from refugees. And so because of that, they're a little more negative on wanting to admit refugees from Afghanistan. Democrats are a little less concerned about this and much more willing to say that they would admit refugees from from Afghanistan into the US. But it will be interesting to see, how other border issues, obviously the Haitian issue, general border issues play up in the next election, because it is, while it's not necessarily always a foreign policy issue per se in American policy circles, it is part of how people think about foreign policy, border control, and those types of issues. So it will be a fascinating thing to watch to see how that's used in the next election. Next slide, and with that is the end of my presentation. So I'm really excited to hear your questions about any of the data that you've seen, or if there's any other data in particular you want me to talk about. I'm on a computer here, so I can always pull up data from our website, which has tons of information that I might not have mentioned here or might have forgotten. And I'm happy to talk through any of that as we move on to the next stage of this presentation.
Thank you very much, Jacob. While we give our guests a little more time to think about their questions, I'm just going to go ahead and ask my question. So I thought it was interesting that the international approval or international trust in President Biden was so much higher than his approval ratings at home. Could you maybe say a few words about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, American public opinion is very polarized. In the past couple presidential cycles, especially, there are overwhelming majorities in each party either support or don't support their own party's president or the opposition. So in the Trump era, 90% of Republicans supported Donald Trump, and 90% of Democrats were against Donald Trump. And so that extreme polarization makes it so that ratings for the US president in the current day rarely get above like 55%. That, it's very hard when you have such a large portion of the public being opposed to that president, whether it's Democrats for a Republican president or Republicans for a Democratic president. Those kinds of factors are not as much in play in countries around the world. Attitudes towards the US president are not as tied up in domestic politics, I would say. There are some differences by ideology in many of these countries. Generally, those on the right, ideologically on the political spectrum are more supportive of the United States in many of the countries that we survey, but those differences aren't that large, and people on the left in many of these countries still like the US president, still see, have confidence in them. And, generally, we only have 4 presidents to work from in this data. We began gathering this data 20 years ago, but in that time, there's only been 4 presidents, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. So far, the pattern seems to be that many people in countries around the world do seem to have a little more positivity towards Democratic presidents than Republican presidents. It's something that we find is interesting. We don't have, I can think of potential reasons why that is, but I don't have hard data in terms of that, but that does tend to be the case. And there's also the final factor is just Trump was not well liked by people in these countries, and Biden is obviously not Trump. And that is definitely something that I think plays a role in why attitudes have shifted so much over the last year.
Just a quick remark for our guests, please use the Q&A function to ask your questions. I saw someone raise their hand. We unfortunately don't have the technical ability to add you via video, but please ask your questions via Q&A. And so Jacob, maybe along those same lines, so we saw that your research showed that international trust in the German chancellor is very, very high. Would you say that considering that we will have a new chancellor, perhaps even before Christmas, who knows, that is based on Germany's foreign policy and role in the world mostly, or is that also to a large degree down to her personality?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, we haven't really dug down into Merkel's ratings based on personal traits, characteristics, or policy really. But we do know from other research that Germany as a country has really high favorable rankings in these same countries that we survey. So there's a lot of positive attitudes towards Germany in virtually all these 17 publics that we surveyed, with one exception, and that's Greece. Greece has a little more negative views of Germany overall. But I think that more positive attitudes towards Germany is one portion of it. But Merkel's ratings have actually risen throughout her tenure in many of these countries, which also I think leads me to believe that her, the length of time in office, the ability to sort of be active on the world stage has increased her ratings and potentially ratings for Germany. And we also had a question earlier on this year about Germany's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. And again, there, people were very positive on how Germany has done. So I think those two factors kind of play into why her ratings are so high relative to the other leaders that we ask about. But as you said, this is the last year of her term, and it will be interesting to see whether A, the ratings continue to the next chancellor, and B, whether whoever that person is sort of prominent enough to be recognized in these surveys. That's one issue with this kind of question about confidence in world leaders, is that there's not many global leaders that probably rise to the stature where people can accurately assess what they think about them. Right now we have 5 people on that list, and it might be hard for people to recognize a new chancellor without a couple years of being in office. So I think that would definitely be an interesting thing to watch as we go through the next couple years.
We have 2 questions from the audience on China. Andreas Pove asks, how is Biden's trade policy regarding China? And it's so he's saying his trade policy regarding China is not that different from Trump, and how's that being perceived by the American public?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. I mean, we generally, it's one of the few issues that Americans are pretty united on, that China is issue in terms of economics, maybe to a lesser extent security, but there's actually bipartisan agreement on a lot of China policies. So you do see that a continuation of the trade policies of the Trump administration, at least currently, and that one reason for that is because Americans do support getting tougher on China. Attitudes towards China in the United States have gotten much worse in recent years. Unfavorability is up to 3/4, where a couple years ago was half or less. It really has gotten a lot worse. A lot of that, again, as I said earlier, is because of human rights. We actually asked this year in the United States an open-ended question. We said, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of China? And the top thing that people said were human rights abuses. Uyghurs, Hong Kong. Those were the kinds of topics that came up. The other issues that came up were economic issues, sort of, competitiveness, the fact that, there's a sense that China is growing as an economy and sort of becoming a rival to the United States on the world stage in terms of its economic power. So, and that was across parties. There wasn't much difference in terms of those attitudes towards China, whether you're Republican or Democrat. So I think that public opinion really does reinforce the continuation of many of Trump's policies in the Biden administration towards China. And there was even a bill that was passed earlier on this year that sort of limited investment in Chinese technology. Was pretty clear, and it was one of the few kind of major bills that passed in this recent Congress. And you see what's happening now. It's very hard to get things passed in the U.S. Congress on a bipartisan nature, but when it comes to China, there is a kind of bipartisan agreement that it's something that the United States needs to focus on, and it generally, comes down in terms of being more restrictive, more aggressive, regardless of which party you support.
Janine Buhlemann also has a question on China, and she suspects that the high approval rates of China in Greece might have something to do with the Chinese investments in Greece. And she's wondering if you have any data on linking financial investments and approval ratings on either China and or the US.
That's interesting. We've tried to do that a couple times. We've had some issues. We had actually an interesting analysis in Nigeria where there did seem to be some linkage between views of China and sort of a train, a railway that was being built. If you were closer to that railway, you actually had slightly more favorable views of China because it was being built by China. I mean, that's a small data point, but there's a general sense that yes, in the emerging and developing countries that we survey, which again, we haven't been able to survey for a couple years because of the pandemic, there is more support for China overall. So in sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, and Central and Eastern Europe. And that could also be because of the Belt and Road initiatives, because of the investment that China is making in some of those countries. And Greece could be definitely one place where that's the case. As my colleague Andy said the other day, Greece does, its attitudes do tend to be more aligned to many places in Central and Eastern Europe rather than Western Europe. And that might also explain their attitudes towards China, where views towards China are a little more favorable in those other countries. Now, again, I think next year we're going to be back in a couple more of those countries, going to be able to assess whether that's still the case. And there's still a lot of countries where, China has invested money in that, still have fairly negative views of China. And it's going to be interesting to see how that changes over time as some of those initiatives maybe become more real to the populations within those countries. But, I do think there is a linkage between Chinese investment and attitudes towards China. And it's always important to realize that the body of countries we're talking about. And in this case, these are advanced economies, mostly democracies, and that does play a role too in attitudes towards China.
And here's another question also related to China. How is the pivot to Asia perceived regarding, so I think basically the question is, do Americans favor another TPP compared to TTIP or another trade deal with Europe? What's the public opinion in America on that?
Yeah, we haven't asked much about trade deals in the last couple years. People in general, when we did ask about trade in previous years in the US and other countries, I think there's a general sense that people like free trade. When you ask it very clearly, do you support this free trade agreement? People, about 55% of Americans typically say yes. However, when you get into the details of what this trade deal would mean, sometimes there's a little less support than there would be overall. I mean, we know that like those types of agreements, TTIP, for example, were sort of toxic in the 2016 presidential election. And so I don't think there's a whole lot of support among the American public to kind of, prioritize trade ties. It's not something that we see as a top priority overall trade policy. But that's also because it's a pretty elite kind of, heady data point for Americans. And as I said earlier, foreign policy issues in general are just not as pervasively followed in the US than maybe in other countries. So as of now, it's unclear what the politics of it will be, but it's not something I'm an expert in terms of trade policy, but the public opinion does not seem to be as closely aligned to maybe, people in foreign policy circles as it is for other issues, where there's a bit more, there's a bit more knowledge of China, attitudes towards China, attitudes towards human rights. Those tend to be the bigger topics. Trade is just not seen as big. Although I will say, as of a couple of years ago, there was a concern about, policy, the U.S. policy towards China basically hurting American jobs. And that's something that is usually on the top of Americans' minds is the domestic economy and how this will affect jobs. And anything that is perceived as hurting the job prospects of Americans is definitely not the most popular of items among the American public.
I do actually have a question that goes back to the domestic side of things. What is your interpretation of the fact that relatively more young Americans disapprove of President Biden's performance? I think you mentioned earlier that that is unusual for a Democratic president.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to entirely, talk to. There's definitely a sense that Biden is not doing as well among young people as a typical Democratic president, and there could be a variety of reasons for it. It could be disappointment, based on expectations of what Biden would do, because in the end, when you look at the voting patterns from the last election, young people were 2-to-1 in favor of Biden over Trump. So one thing could be disappointment. They thought Biden would be maybe more liberal, maybe more left, focusing more on climate change, focusing more on the issues that young people, really talk about in the US, and maybe they're disappointed. The other option could be is that the voting in 2020 was more against Trump rather than for Biden. So that the support for Biden in the election was more, not being Trump. And then once Biden is president, it sort of goes back to kind of standard attitudes. And we'll see. Again, the interesting thing is, what will that mean for the midterm vote? Generally, in midterm elections, there's lower turnout than presidential elections. And the people who don't vote in midterms tend to be younger people. So, but at the same time, without that support from young people, the Democratic Party is really, it might find itself in quite a hole because it needs the support, because that's one of their strongest demographic groups in terms of voting. And if they don't show up, even if these negative ratings don't turn into voting for the Republicans, just not showing up can really damage the prospects for the US to continue to hold the House and the Senate.
Yeah, and actually there's a follow-up question on also the differences within the electorate, their approval of Biden. So there's also a divergence between white and blacks and Hispanic voters disapproving or approving of Biden. Why do you think that more whites potentially disapprove of him right now?
Well, I mean, that's a very consistent pattern in American politics. For the past decades, the black vote in the United States has been much more democratic than the white vote. So that those numbers are not necessarily as surprising as they are for the young people. Actually, it's the same way that it is surprising is that the numbers, the support among blacks at 67% is actually down from 85% in March. So there's been quite a large decline in positive ratings towards Biden among Black Americans. Again, a core Democratic Party support constituency, and that's got to be worrying for the election people in the Biden administration. But yeah, generally, white Americans have not been as positive on Democratic presidents for the last couple cycles. Typically, it's around 40% when it comes to the vote of white Americans vote for Democrats versus the other side voting for Republicans. And especially among whites in the US, those from rural areas, those with a high school education or less, and evangelical Christians are highly supportive of Republican candidates and Trump in particular. So those patterns are pretty consistent across years, but the question is, which voting coalitions come out to vote, which show their support, and in there, the recent ratings for Biden again are potentially worrying for if an election was held right now for what would happen for the Democratic Party, and would be probably pretty positive for the Republican Party if it happened now, which of course it's not. There is one election actually that's upcoming in the U.S. state of Virginia in November, and that could potentially be seen as a bellwether state. That's a state that what has become increasingly more towards the Democrats' side in recent years as there's been sort of growth. I live in Washington, D.C., so I have a little more knowledge of this political environment, but there's been growth in the suburbs, and Democrats have actually been making gains in suburbs in recent years. And that is something that will be interesting to see, because if the Republicans win or overperform, it's sort of a sign that their party might have the upper hand going into next year's midterm elections.
I do have another question from the audience. I don't know if you can answer this as a pollster, but we'll give it a shot. What about the most recent digital trade deal being discussed with Asia now? I don't know if you have any data on that.
Not really. We're actually in the middle of coming up with questions for our survey next year. These international comparative surveys take a long time to kind of do. And so even though we're not going to field this survey till March, May next year, we are actually focusing a bit on youth engagement in politics, and one part of that is social media engagement. How are people? What are people doing online? What are they talking about online? How does potentially communicating with others about politics on social media, does that translate to voting? Does that translate to political activism in other ways? And the current generation of Americans and elsewhere around the world are very, digitally oriented. They use social media a lot. It's, in many ways is the primary way in which they get news. And so, digital issues are a big, talking point, both, in the US and around the world. And we actually, we do have some other data that points to generally there's a positive views of the way that some of this digital technology is being utilized, but there's also some great concerns about how it's regulated, the size of companies, especially in the United States, like Facebook, the power that they have, and of course, there's the issue of digital companies, especially Chinese digital companies, Huawei, ZTE, that are an issue again in higher level circles in the United States. Whether that's filtered down to the general public, it's not clear yet. So I guess I don't have like a direct answer, but that's what I know about those issues from a public opinion perspective. But I'm hoping we'll have a little more on that over the next year, especially as we start fielding our survey for next year, which again, hopefully will be in a couple more countries around the world as sort of face-to-face interviewing becomes more possible.
I would like to perhaps ask you one last question about the other big topic that you touched upon, Afghanistan. And I was wondering, do you think that, so you've shown that there has been great support for the initial decision to pull out of Afghanistan. Do you think that the approval that Biden would potentially be getting for that is now will long-term be buried under the disapproval of how things played out, of how he handled the situation?
Yeah, as I said earlier, foreign policy is generally not the top priority of Americans, especially in like a midterm election where you're not deciding who's commander in chief. So, if you look at it historically, when you ask people in an election year, are they focusing on foreign policy or domestic policy? It's usually like 80% say domestic, 20% say foreign. So it might be an issue in the campaign, and there's reasons to believe that the Republicans will bring it up as an issue pretty frequently. But it's unlikely to be the dominant theme of the campaign, with the coronavirus pandemic, the economy, potentially inflation, which hasn't been an issue really in the U.S. in a while. The border, immigration overall, not necessarily related to Afghanistan, although it could be tied to it. I don't want to make predictions, as I said, because that's not what I do. But just historically, there hasn't been a lot of focus on foreign policy. So I would say most likely, if there is an issue if there is a topic of foreign policy, it will probably be like on China rather than Afghanistan. But you never know. I mean, things could happen. Something could happen that makes it an issue again, whatever that might be. Or there could be other issues that sort of, come into the fore. It could turn out to be Russia, North Korea, Iran. There's all these other topics that right now are not at the top of Americans' lists in terms of priorities. But that could always change. The spread of infectious diseases wasn't a big issue for Americans just 2 years ago, and now it's one among the top issues that Americans think about and deal with every day. So that's why it's so important that we ask the same questions over and over and over again, because we really need to see how attitudes change on those core questions to sort of understand the state of the world today. And it will be very interesting to see what happens in the future on those issues. Sorry, just one more thing on that is climate change is also potentially another issue there, which does come to the fore. Again, though, young people and Democrats are much more, concerned about climate change. They're much more likely to say it's a priority than Republicans. So I'm not sure how much that's going to be a part of the campaign, but certainly with the current bills that are working their way through Congress, I think kind of like climate policy, energy policy, could potentially be topics that come up again over the next year in the U.S. and probably elsewhere around the world.
Well, we very much look forward to hearing from you once you have new data on those issues. Well, thank you so much for being here and for answering all the questions. Yeah, it's been great having you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. It's been a pleasure. And if anyone else has more questions, feel free to send them my way afterwards. All our data is up on our website. It's free to use. Eventually, we even put out our data sets so people can do their own analysis. So check out our website, pewresearch.org, and you can find all the data there. And thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Jacob. Bye.
Thank you, Katharina.